My name is Alan Goldhamer, and since 1984 I've been the director here at the Residential Healthcare Program at the True North Health Center located in Santa Rosa, California. One of the many tools used by the doctors at the True North Health Center is a program of medically supervised water-only fasting. In the past 25 years, we've supervised the fasting of over 7,000 participants with a variety of health concerns including high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and autoimmune diseases including lupus, rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, colitis, asthma, and psoriasis. Today I'll be discussing our experience in the use of fasting in a variety of conditions, but I'll start with a condition that is common, deadly, and very responsive to fasting. That condition is high blood pressure. High blood pressure and its associated diseases is one of the leading contributing causes of death and disability in industrialized countries. If you look at this chart from the World Health Report, you can see that tobacco, blood pressure, alcohol use, elevated cholesterol, obesity, low fruit and vegetable intake, and physical inactivity, as well as illicit drugs, all are the major contributing causes to premature death. When we talk about blood pressure, we have two numbers, the top number, or systolic blood pressure, and the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure. These are both important independent risk factors for all-cause mortality associated with elevated blood pressure. The systolic blood pressure represents the pressure in your blood vessels when the heart's contracting. And the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure, represents the pressure in your blood vessels when the heart's in its relaxation phase. High blood pressure and its associated conditions, as I said, are one of the contributing causes to all-cause mortality. It contributes to many, many different diseases. For example, 200,000 people die each year from congestive heart failure, and high blood pressure is the leading preventable factor associated with this. 700,000 people have strokes, which are essentially brain attacks where the brain doesn't get adequate blood flow. High blood pressure is the leading contributing cause of stroke. In the United States, most people will develop high blood pressure sometime during their lifetime. It's responsible for millions of visits to physicians. It's the leading justification for prescription medications. But what's interesting is that drug intervention when it comes to high blood pressure is actually quite disappointing. The majority of people that have heart attacks and strokes because of high blood pressure actually have blood pressure that's not yet elevated enough to justify the use of medications. Because there are risks associated with medications, they don't recommend blood pressure medications until such time as the risk-reward ratios of those medications is positive. For example, a person that has a blood pressure of 138/88 is absolutely at increased risk for having a heart attack, about 5-fold compared to those that say have a blood pressure at a healthier level of 110/70. But at 130/88, most studies indicate that the risk of the medication can exceed the benefits. And so it's not typically recommended unless a person has some concomitant end-organ target disease or other issues. For every point that the systolic blood pressure is reduced, 1 point, through diet and lifestyle intervention, there's a 1% reduction in all-cause mortality. That is not just deaths from heart attacks or strokes, but deaths from any cause is reduced by 1% for every point the systolic blood pressure is dropped. And that benefit goes down probably all the way to 90/60, which according to some research is what probably optimum blood pressure is for human beings. This is how we manage blood pressure today, various forms of medications. And what's interesting is that most research suggests that the more expensive newer medications don't actually work any better than the less expensive older medications. Once medications are no longer effective, there is a sophisticated amount of mechanical interventions that are used to try to deal with the consequences of blood pressure, none of which are very satisfying. If we look at thousands of studies that have been done on what does work at lowering blood pressure, we find out there's actually been a large body of evidence supporting certain interventions. For example, weight loss. For every kilogram of weight that's lost, there's an average 1.6 drops in systolic blood pressure. People that lose a lot of weight often get significant benefits in overall reductions of their blood pressure. A vegetarian high-fiber diet, even independent of weight loss, is associated with a reduction in blood pressure. Alcohol reduction. Now, I know many of you believe that alcohol is some sort of health food. You've actually heard some physicians actually recommend alcohol in relation to people that have cardiovascular problems. But alcohol is not a health food, and it's not your friend when it comes to blood pressure. Eliminating alcohol can result in substantial reductions in blood pressure. You know the expression that statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics? Well, I think there's no place that that's probably more true than when it comes to the promotion, sometimes the shameless promotion of alcohol as sometimes some kind of health benefit. Now, there's no denying that, for example, in wine, there still are some residual nutrients that haven't been completely destroyed in the process of making wine. Those same nutrients, for example, may be present in eating foods like fresh grapes. It actually turns out that many of these agents are actively in the skin itself of the grape. But nobody's giving you front page headlines telling you to eat grapes, but they are recommending that you consume alcohol. Exercise is associated with a 7 to 8 point drop on average in systolic blood pressure. So people that engage in regular aerobic exercise, walking, hiking, biking, swimming, things that get your heart beating, that get you sweating, are associated with a consistent and predictable reduction in blood pressure. Drugs are also effective at lowering blood pressure, and any combination of medications on average can be associated with a drop of about 12 points in systolic blood pressure. Now, that 12-point reduction from medications is enough to reduce your risk of dying, for example, from consequences like stroke, enough to offset the increased risk of dying as a consequence of the medication. So the risk-reward ratio for people with the highest levels of hypertension does support the use of medications. But what's interesting is aggressive sodium restriction, that is sodium restriction of greater than 1 milligram of sodium per calorie, or around 2,000 milligrams a day of sodium or less, is actually associated with substantial reduction in blood pressure that, according to some studies, actually exceed the benefit derived from medication use. And a combination of those interventions, that is, weight loss, vegetarian diet, eliminating alcohol, instituting exercise, and restricting sodium, was done by my colleague John McDougall at St. Helena Hospital, where he looked at several hundred people's blood pressure and what happened to them when he implemented a health promotion program. And he found an average drop of 17 points, which is amongst the larger effects in the scientific literature in reducing blood pressure in humans. Now, this treatment F here was a study that we conducted along with our colleagues from Cornell University here at the True North Health Center. And in this study, we were able to demonstrate an average drop of 37 points in blood pressure. We took 174 consecutive patients that had high blood pressure, and 174 people were able to achieve a reduction in blood pressure enough to eliminate the need for medication. And the average drop of 37 points was exceeded only by the average drop in the patients that had stage 3 hypertension, that is those that started at 180 milligrams or higher on the systolic blood pressure. They actually dropped an average of 60 points on average. And actually, those numbers are even higher in the sense that many of those people were initially medicated, and their baseline blood pressures were taking on medication. And yet at the end of the study, all patients were off all medications. And so whatever effect the medications may have been having are actually added to the effect sizes that we were able to demonstrate. If we look at the results in this study, you'll see here on this chart that the average blood pressure of our stage 3 hypertensives was 194 at the completion of fasting, which ranged from 5 to 24 days. Their average blood pressure was just 134. For those that started with more moderate levels of hypertension, the results were predictable, as you can see from this chart. The reality is that patients with high blood pressure, if they undergo water-only fasting and then follow it with a health-promoting diet and exercise program, are able to demonstrate the largest effects that have ever been published in the scientific literature in treating high blood pressure in humans, as we were able to show in this study that appeared in JMPT in 2001. It took us a long time to get that first study published. And it was interesting, actually, in presenting our results to a variety of various journals, we got a variety of interesting responses. Ultimately, we did get it published in a peer-reviewed index journal, and it made our publication of our second study much easier. It took us 12 years to get the first paper completed. It took us about 12 months to get the second study done. And in this study, we took a different group of patients that had what's considered borderline hypertension. High enough to increase the risk of dying, but not so high as to justify the need for medical intervention in terms of blood pressure drugs. And we put them through a very similar process, 5 to 40 days of water-only fasting followed by a health-promoting diet, and demonstrated very predictable and consistent results as well. That paper appeared in 2002 in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. Both of these papers were reviewed by Clinical Nutrition Updates, where they did kind of a review of the work that we had done and concluded that fasting appeared to be a safe and effective means of dealing with high blood pressure in humans. Once our papers were published, we began to get interest from both researchers as well as clinicians. One of the groups that expressed interest in the work that we were doing was the International Union of Operating Engineers, that's Local 3, a very large labor union. And they were interested in finding ways of reducing their progressive and increasing costs for managing high blood pressure and diabetes and related conditions and the consequences that occurred because of them in terms of medical costs. And so we were invited to a meeting of this union. These are the guys that run a lot of the big equipment that you see that builds the highways. And they tend to be hardworking individuals. Here's my grandson, Colin, sitting in the cab of one of these vehicles. In any case, they asked us to come to a meeting and present the results of our studies, to share with them our research data, because they had the impression that perhaps a program like that's offered at True North Health Center could help them cut some of their burgeoning medical costs. And so we went and we presented our data, and they had different representatives there. One of the gentlemen had had some background working for the National Institute of Health as a consultant. He suggested that perhaps that a health promotion approach like this would actually save them money. There was an active discussion that ensued. One of the representatives of the contractors expressed a concern about the fact that they were already spending tremendous amounts of money on the health care benefits of these individuals, and that it seemed unreasonable to now also request that they be offered to go on some kind of luxury vacation as part of their health benefit. And I described in very exquisite detail what the process of fasting actually entailed, where a person would go for 5 to 40 days on water only, experience various symptoms that are associated with detoxification, and the stringent diet and lifestyle changes that would occur as a consequence of this program. And he admitted perhaps it wasn't exactly a vacation. One of the gentlemen who was actually an actuary who calculates the monthly pension benefits of the individuals that managed to survive long enough to get to retirement raised a question. He said, "Dr. Goldhamer, if we do this program and it works, won't they live longer?" And that was a rather interesting question. I wasn't quite sure exactly how to answer that, because there's no question if you don't die early, then you tend to live longer, and that's going to result in additional payouts for pension benefits. But I didn't have to say too much, because one of the crane operators, I kind of knew he was a crane operator because his neck was much thicker than my thigh, so I could tell he was a hardworking guy. He stood up and he said, "Listen, little man," addressing the actuary. He said, "You should remember who you work for. You work for us, and I suggest you do a calculation and figure out how much money we're going to save if I were to come over there and break your neck." After a long discussion, they voted unanimously to make our program a fully covered medical benefit for any member of the union or their family that suffers with high blood pressure and diabetes, or diabetes. And as a consequence, we began to admit members of the union that had these conditions, and we did another study. And what we did is we took the first several dozen members from the union, and we did some calculations. We looked at what their medical costs per member on average were prior to coming into our program and in the years after the program. And we looked at what their health condition was prior to the program, after the program, and on follow-up. And what we found was that in the first 30 consecutive members that we admitted from the union, their average weight loss during the program at the center, which averaged 3 weeks, was 26 pounds. And on follow-up, which ranged from 2 to 12 months, their weight loss was down 28 pounds, which means they had actually maintained their weight loss and lost just a little bit more. Maybe not as much more as I might have liked, but nonetheless, they were maintaining some of the benefits that showed up in their blood pressure, the systolic blood pressure, which dropped 30 points during the fast, and on release from the fasting protocol, was down 27.6 points on follow-up, and diastolic changes were proportionally similar. What that meant was that they had, in fact, been able to sustain much of the benefits they got from our intensive inpatient experience, where they underwent water-only fasting in a medically supervised setting, went through a health-promoting diet and lifestyle program, which we implemented at the True North Health Center, and then followed the recommendations when they went home at least well enough to maintain much of these results. What the union was excited was a cost of care analysis. It turns out that the cost to the union out of pocket per member was $57.84 prior to going through the True North Health program, and just $3,000 in the year after the program, which means their total medical costs had reduced more than the entire cost of the union of the program itself in the first year alone. What did we do with these members in order to help them resolve their high blood pressure and their diabetes? What we did was we helped them go through a period of medically supervised water-only fasting. Fasting can be defined as the complete abstinence from all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. It's different than starvation, which is actually abstinence from nourishment beyond the point where the body's nutritional reserves are exhausted, and impairment of vital organ function and structure ensues. In other words, first you fast, and if you fast long enough, if you go enough days, weeks, or months to deplete your labile nutrient reserves, you eventually enter a process called starvation. And starvation ultimately would result in death. So we don't fast people into starvation because that would negatively impact our long-term outcome data. If you look at the biochemistry of fasting, you find that the average 70-kilogram male, so a male that's a little bit less than 160 pounds, would have on average 12.6 kilograms of fat, and that represents 18% of the body weight, or 117,000 calories. With a basal metabolic rate of 1 calorie per kilogram per hour, that equals about a 70-day supply of fuel. So the average thin male would have potential reserves, at least nutrient reserves, fat storage of about 70 days. But what's interesting is even moderate activity will double caloric utilization and increase protein utilization as well. So one of the important things we have to do to adapt to this biological adaptation of fasting is to ensure that people get rest. There are actually 4 phases that we can think about in relation to fasting. The first is the gastrointestinal phase, and it lasts about 6 hours, and that's when you utilize the nutrient reserves that are in your intestinal tract. Everybody fasts. If you think about it, you eat your dinner and you go to bed and you don't eat again until the morning when you eat a meal called breakfast. You break your fast of the evening before, and by the time you get to breakfast, you've actually gone through this gastrointestinal phase. You've used up the nutrient reserves that were in the intestinal tract, and you've begun to call on these other phases of fasting in order to sustain yourself. One of those phases, glycogenolysis, is where you're using glycogen stores as a source of sugar for both your muscles as well as your brain being the largest burner of glucose in the body. There's another process that comes in called gluconeogenesis. Now, this is a process where you break down protein in order to elaborate nutrients that can be used for fuel. And another phase of fasting, or ketosis, is where your body utilizes the byproducts of fatty acid metabolism to produce ketone bodies, which actually can then be burned by the brain. The human being is one of the few animals on the planet that has the ability to actually convert from burning the normal fuel, which is glucose, to burning a byproduct of fat metabolism, which are ketones. And so this is a unique adaptation that makes it possible for us to fast. Were it not for this biological capacity, we would not be able to fast for very many days before we rapidly deplete our protein reserves and enter starvation. By the end of the second week of fasting, the majority of energy is actually derived from the metabolism of ketone bodies. Most of our fuel is coming from breaking down fat. And as I said, even the brain itself begins to burn predominantly ketone bodies rather than its normal exclusive fuel of glucose. The biochemistry of fasting induces metabolic and hormonal changes essentially to draw upon our supply of fat, to spare our vital proteins, and to conserve nutrient resources. Because what your brain is doing is saying, there is nothing to eat, So we need to begin to enter this adaptive state to conserve our resources until food is once again made available. And it works out very well. For example, if spring comes late, your body's capable of adapting to that state without dying. And this adaptation of fasting, this biological adaptation, is something that we're able to utilize to help the body to overcome diseases that are associated with dietary excess in particular. The conditions that are caused by dietary excess, these conditions like high blood pressure and obesity and type 2 diabetes, and are aggravated like in autoimmune diseases, these conditions that are either caused or aggravated by dietary excess often are very responsive to appropriately conducted supervised water-only fasting. The fasting state gives the body to mobilize and eliminate a lot of these accumulated intermediary products of metabolism that build up inside the tissues of the cell, to mobilize them, process them, and eliminate them. The indications for fasting, when is fasting appropriate, are actually fairly broad. One indication of fasting, perhaps the most obvious indication of fasting, is the loss of appetite that characterizes acute illness. When people are sick, they often have no appetite. They have no desire for food. In fact, it was Herbert Shelton that said in one of his books that fasting had its origins in the dim uncertainties of the long-forgotten past when the first wounded animal found that it had no desire for food. And that is absolutely true for humans as well. There's a very natural disinclination to eat when we are acutely ill. Fasting can be used both in acute and chronic illnesses with good utility. It can be used to give the body a chance to accelerate healing. It can be used to help in behavioral change, and it can also be used as a psychospiritual tool, as witnessed by the fact that most major religions have a tradition associated with therapeutic fasting. In selecting people that are appropriate for a fasting experience, it's important that a complete medical history be taken, a physical examination be performed, and laboratory evaluations be evaluated. These allow the experienced practitioner to make a determination about who's likely to be a good candidate or a poor candidate for this type of intervention. There's a general experience in fasting that is often shared by people going through this experience. And I'd like to talk about some of these symptoms that occur and perhaps talk about why we believe they may be happening. For one thing, one of the most universal effects in fasting is a foul taste in the mouth. When you go on a fast and your body begins to mobilize and eliminate accumulated products of metabolism, the mouth often tastes very bad, almost like something crawled in there and then died. That, what I call faster's mouth, is a kind of a unique and characteristic experience that's pretty much universally experienced. In addition, people often experience increased body odor associated with fasting. As the body begins to use the skin as a secondary eliminative organ and people begin to purge themselves, they often get to the point where they notice a substantial increase in a malodorous body. Fatigue is pretty well universal. As the body goes through this biological adaptation, it begins to slow its metabolic rate and conserve its protein and nutrient resources. An experience of fatigue becomes very apparent. Sleep disruption. Sleep disturbance is very common. People have trouble getting to sleep, staying asleep. They're hypervigilant during fasting oftentimes. In part, that may be because of a reduced biological need for sleep, given the resting state. In part, it's because the brain is actually changing fuels from burning the normal fuel of glucose to burning a different fuel of ketone bodies. But sleep disruption is often dominant. Although after fasting, many people with chronic sleep difficulties are profoundly affected to the positive. Restlessness, irritability, and in some cases even what we call a euphoria, almost a euphoric state that occurs as the body goes through this adaptive process, are very frequent in fasting patients. Dizziness is very common. Orthostatic hypotension, where people get up and get dizzy. Again, the body's adapting by slowing everything down. You get up too quickly, the blood has trouble getting to your brain efficiently. because of this reduced autonomic tone, and as a consequence, your brain can induce a dizzy response in an effort to make sure that it doesn't get starved of oxygen. The answer to that, of course, is ensuring people move around slowly and don't engage in inappropriate activities during fasting. Aches and pains. Many chronic problems will become much more acute during fasting. Many things, even that didn't bother you before fasting, may bother you during fasting. For example, low back pain. It's very common in early phase fasting. In part, that may be because the kidneys themselves are processing the blood, where a lot of these materials are being metabolized and introduced. And the kidneys are the main detoxifying organ of the blood, and when they produce urine, it essentially is the byproducts of having filtered the blood. And so it's not surprising where this increased kidney load would result in what's called a viscerosomatic reflux, where the kidneys refer pain into the low back, and it can be quite distressing early phase fasting. It eventually goes away, and then new miserable symptoms arise. Nausea and vomiting is very common, especially early phase fasting, as the liver, the main detoxifying organ of the body, begin to dump bile, the yellow-green pigments which are so caustic and irritating, into the system. If there's excess amounts of bile, it can reflux into the stomach, and it can induce nausea and vomiting. Rashes and discharges, including discharges from mucous membranes throughout the body, are frequent. Sometimes people get very dramatic rashing and discharging happening through the skin. And the healing crisis itself, where chronic problems become acute and people feel miserable, and then oftentimes, interestingly enough, those chronic problems resolve. The nature of fasting is often to give the body a chance to demonstrate an acute response to a chronic problem and resolve the chronicity. It's very interesting, it's dramatic. It's not possible to explain every mechanism of fasting because research in this area is really just now in its infancy. I remember one time I had a woman who was referred to me by a medical practitioner from a nearby town, and she was a woman in her early 70s who had long-standing problems with severe rheumatoid arthritis, hypertension, obesity, and related conditions of dietary excess. And her doctor had suggested that she come to us to undergo care and that we might be to be of help to her. And she said to me that she really liked her doctor and she trusted him. And she said, but he's such a kidder. He said that what you were going to do is put me in a room and not feed me for 2 weeks. She thought that was the funniest thing, until I explained to her it would be more like 3, and that we called it therapeutic water-only fasting. And she became a little bit alarmed, and she said, well, do you mean nothing at all? And I said, yes. And she said, what would happen if she did that? I mean, would she actually survive it, not eating anything but water only for up to 3 weeks? And I said, yes, she would survive it, and that what would happen is first, she would have a foul taste in her mouth, as if something crawled in there and died. And then she'd have increased body odor, where she wouldn't even want to be in the same room with herself. And then she'd have fatigue and sleep disruption, restlessness, irritability, dizziness, aches, pains, nausea, vomiting, rashes, discharges, and maybe some healing crisis. And finally, hearing that list of symptoms that she was likely to experience, she interrupted me and she said, "My, you're quite the salesman. Where do I sign up?" But in any case, she came in and she fasted. It ended up being a 26-day fast. And she had a remarkable result. She was able to get off of her medications. She was able to normalize her blood pressure. She got out of pain. She lost her weight. And she went back home to visit the doctor that had referred her. And he called me up the day that she came into his office. And he seemed rather excited. He said it was rather dramatic, seeing the tremendous clinical changes in just a few weeks. He'd never really seen anything quite that dramatic before. And he said, but she said that she had fasted for 26 days. How did we get her to fast for 26 days? And I said, well, because I thought I'd give him a hard time. I said, well, doc, she was so resistant, what we decided to do finally was just tie her up. And he said, you did not. And then he turned to her and said, did they tie you up? Because he wasn't quite sure. He later actually joined our staff until his retirement, and because he said he wanted to spend the last years of his practice doing something worthwhile and actually getting people well. So he was very impressed. She had a good outcome, and she did very well. She stuck to the program. And I knew she'd be a good patient because she had inflammatory arthritis, which, you know, if you eat poor food, you begin to feel poorly very quickly. And so it really helps if people have pain, problems where they have a lot of pain and suffering and misery, because then when they get well, it's very dramatic, and then if they try to eat garbage, they feel poorly again. And I always think back to a woman that we had, also as a patient with autoimmune disease from England, whose son was an internist who had kind of convinced her to come and do a fast with us. And she did the fast, and she had a good outcome. And when she was leaving, she was a very proper English lady, you know, and she said, you know, Dr. Goldhamer, I really didn't mind the fast, but I don't know about all this diet nonsense. You know, and she was a little skeptical about having to stick to a plant-based vegetarian diet. But she said she'd give it a shot. And she went home, and she wrote to me after 6 months, and the letter said, "Dear Dr. Goldhamer, you were so right. When I eat crap, I feel crappy." And what she'd experienced was that whenever she tried to cheat too much, her body kind of let her know that she was eating beyond her capacity, or symptoms began to return. Because remember, we don't suggest that we're curing anything. All we're doing is coming up with an effective management strategy to keep these unfortunate conditions at bay so that you can live a healthy life, hopefully a long and healthy life, without having to suffer the consequences of aggressive medical intervention treatment. Fasting duration varies. Minor acute problems may only take 1 to 5 days of fasting in order to give the body an edge to resolve it. A major acute problem might take up to 2 weeks of fasting to give the body what it needs in order to get ahead of the game, so to speak. Chronic problems, things like asthma and psoriasis and arthritis, might take several weeks of fasting in order to get the kind of resolution we're looking for. So depending on the person and their circumstances, the use of fasting can vary considerably. Now, I've made a suggestion today that therapeutic fasting, when it's properly done and appropriately supervised, is the most effective tool that's ever been published in terms of treating, for example, high blood pressure in human beings. Let's take a look at what possible mechanisms might be at play that might explain how it is possible that essentially doing nothing intelligently could result in a dramatic resolution of chronic diseases that up till now most people believe that there's either nothing that can be done or you have to take these drugs the rest of your life, etc. With fasting, people lose weight. In fact, 100% of people that fast lose weight. Every single person that fasts loses weight. The laws of thermodynamics, the laws of physics apparently interplay. If you don't eat, you lose weight. Now, I have had patients that will argue that they are an exception to the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of physics, because they'll tell me that they've been on diets and it doesn't matter what they eat, they can't lose weight. I had a patient come in for fasting who was very skeptical because she said she'd been on every diet, she could never lose weight, and she didn't think she could lose weight fasting. And on the very first day of fast, she gained a pound. She actually went up a pound as her body held onto some fluid, and she was thrilled. She felt completely vindicated because she said, "See, Dr. Goldhamer, even water fasting, I gain weight." Now, overall, she lost a pound a day just like everybody else that fasts. Average weight loss in fasting is a pound. It wasn't an exception in her case. In addition to weight loss, there's a process called natriuresis. Natriuresis is the body's selective mobilization and elimination of excess sodium in the system. And as the body flushes out the excess salt, the excess blood volume that goes along with that excess salt and the excess fluid that goes along with that excess salt goes with it. And so we see rapid reductions in things like edema and swelling, in congestive heart failure, in conditions where there's excess fluids collecting. Those symptoms begin to reduce quickly. And so people can lose not just a pound a day of tissue normally associated with fasting, but many pounds a day initially as they diurese and get these excess fluids out of the body. That can affect improvement in breathing, cardiac function. It can allow better circulation, so non-healing wounds begin to heal. You see lots of changes associated with this powerful diuretic effect associated with fasting. And everybody that goes through water-only fasting appears to experience this type of a response. In fact, even small amounts of carbohydrate, like might be introduced where you have juice fasting or modified fasting, will significantly change the rapidity with which this process occurs. The traditional mechanism of fasting has been thought to be detoxification. Detoxification, mobilizing and eliminating toxins in the body. Well, what are we talking about when we say toxins? It turns out there's two kinds of toxins that we generally talk about. Exogenous toxins, that is toxins that come from the outside, things like PCB and dioxin and pesticide residues and chemical things and stuff that really, from a practical standpoint, should never have existed in our environment. But they do exist today and they get into our bodies. And endogenous toxins, which in some cases aren't really even technically toxins, things like uric acid and cholesterol and things that are supposed to be there. They're normal byproducts of metabolism, but when they're there in excess quantity, may present problems. And things like intracellular pigments like creoid or lipofuscin or other types of materials that are actually thought to be part of the aging process itself, where these materials begin to build up over time inside our cells, till eventually they can begin to mechanically and or chemically interfere with cellular function and contribute to the processes such as aging and ultimately cellular death. Well, we believe that in fasting, the body has been given the opportunity to begin to mobilize, process, and eliminate these materials that have accumulated in the body over long periods of time. And there's good reason to believe that, in fact, that's exactly what's happening. Whether we'll look at the studies on PCB poisoning or pre and post fat biopsies and studies where they show total levels actually drop, to our clinical experience watching these changes occur in people. Detoxification occurs during fasting. In fact, some people have believed that the detoxification is so rapid, in fact, that you have to take expensive proprietary nutrient supplements to ensure that your various phases of detoxification are adequate to keep up with the load that's generated by fasting. In our experience, in fact, that's not true, that patients that are adequately nourished prior to fasting are able to very efficiently keep up with the load generated by the body, mobilize and eliminate these products, and it results in both subjective and objective improvement in a variety of physiological functions. For example, many patients have elevated liver enzymes that are demonstrated on blood tests that indicate inflammation or damage to the liver. In fasting, it's true that sometimes those levels will actually go up even higher while you're fasting. And if you continue to fast, they'll actually not only go back down to your pre-fasting levels, but actually sometimes will completely normalize, suggesting that the body's not only has the body been able to generate an acute healing response, but actually resolve sometimes these ongoing problems. Enzymes are proteins. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze physiological functions. Enzyme systems are used to mobilize things like fat, carbohydrates, and proteins, and they're also used in the detoxification process. Now, what's interesting, when you fast, you force your fat, protein, and carbohydrate mobilizing enzyme systems to be induced, much like a competitive athlete does when they do marathon training. They get better at gluconeogenesis. They get better at lipolysis because they induce enzyme systems necessary to carry out these physiological functions. Well, fasting does the same thing. Fasting forces your body to mobilize fat stores, for example, and it induces enzyme systems associated with that need. Those enzyme systems apparently persist even after fasting has been completed. And so many people find, for example, that have problems with blood sugar regulation. They get symptoms that might require their well-meaning but misguided physician to recommend multiple small meals in order to sustain their energy. That after fasting, they no longer have to engage in these practices because they're able to mobilize and utilize their glycogen stores, for example, more efficiently. And as a consequence, they don't get these big vacillations and hypoglycemic responses as a direct consequence of undergone a water-only fast. As far as detoxifying enzyme systems, it's also thought that the detoxification increase, which clearly happens in fasting, the rapidity with which the body is able to mobilize and eliminate these toxic products, forces the body to induce enzyme systems, and those enzyme systems may very well persist post-fasting, allowing us to be more efficient at detoxifying even long after the fast is completed. It's been long recognized that, for example, periodic fasting or systematic underfeeding in rats can double their lifespan. Now, it's my belief that you're not actually increasing the lifespan of the rats because of the fasting as much as you are avoiding the consequences of dietary excess. For example, if a rat is given ad libitum eating, They eat a certain amount, they live a certain amount of time. If you feed them 60% of that amount, that you can double their lifespan. And I believe it's because what you're really doing is feeding rats at a level more consistent with their biological history. And instead of the overeating that would occur in a very unnatural state when they're fed ad libitum or given as much as they want to eat. In a natural setting, rats are always working really hard to get enough to eat and not get eaten. And it turns out they eat about 60% of the calories on average that they would eat in an environment where they're given unlimited amounts of food. And when you take that natural dietary intake and remove predation from the environment, they live to what is in fact their normal lifespan. So I'd argue you're actually killing rats in half the time by overfeeding them, rather than doubling their lifespan through systematic underfeeding. But in any case, if you periodically fast rats, they live longer. If you eliminate dietary excess in animals, whether it's rats or mice or other animals, they do better. And humans, it turns out, are no exception. Insulin is a hormone, and it drives sugar from inside your bloodstream into the cells where the body actually utilizes it as principal fuel. When insulin is not able to do its job properly, either because there's not enough insulin or there's enough insulin, but there's resistance to that insulin at the cell level where it does its job, whether it's in the liver or inside other cells, that resistance or insulin resistance is associated with an increased level of blood sugar. We call that diabetes. That's what diabetes is, essentially, an increased resistance to insulin. It's increased resistance to insulin, not deficiency of insulin, because the average type 2 diabetic, the adult onset diabetic that makes up 95% of the diabetics in our society, actually make more, not less insulin. It's just the insulin can't do its job because of resistance. Now, the drugs that are used to treat diabetes or insulin resistance do not reduce insulin resistance. They're not effective at resolving the fundamental problem there. But what is effective at reducing insulin resistance appears to be fasting. A health-promoting diet and exercise following fasting combined together is the most powerful tool we've seen at helping people normalize their blood sugar and create an internal environment where they can sustain normal blood sugars, and in a large percentage of cases without the ongoing need for medication. Another mechanism by which fasting may have a profound effect on the body is dealing with a problem that's often referred as gut leakage. Now, a human being has a tunnel that goes through their body. That tunnel starts in the mouth, it goes down the throat, and into the esophagus, and then into the stomach, eventually into the three parts of the small bowel, then the large bowel, then into the rectum, and then eventually people push it out through the anus at the other end. So they're shoving stuff in one end, it's going through this digestive system, and eventually they push it out the other end. But all the while, that material is in the gut. It's not technically inside your body. Now, you swallowed it, you can't see it anymore, but it's technically going through your body. It's not yet in your body. It doesn't get in the body until it gets through a very, very fine mesh that is represented here by this screen. And that mesh of your intestinal mucosa is designed to filter out large molecules, big peptides, proteins, viruses, bacteria, etc. Keep that stuff from getting inside the body and allowing it to be pushed out the other end. But what would happen, just like a screen keeps moths and flies out, what would happen if the holes in the screen were made bigger? What if the screen got torn? What if something happened to that screen that allowed flies and bugs to get in? Well, we know what would happen in our house. What happens in our body? If something widens the screen mesh of our body, peptide molecules, protein molecules, large things can get into our bloodstream, and they has to be dealt with. And the way that the body deals with those invaders is with our immune system. And it's well equipped to handle certain infiltrations. However, in genetically vulnerable people, if this process of gut leakage, that is leaking in things into the body that's not supposed to be there, is excessive, in those genetically vulnerable people, the immune system, for reasons that we're still trying to understand, goes awry. It stops working properly. And if the part of the immune system starts overreacting to these foreign invaders, it may begin to react to our body tissue itself as a foreign tissue. For example, in ulcerative colitis, it's actually the immune system of the body that's generating the inflammation associated with the bleeding and mucus and lesions that are associated with this condition. In arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, it's actually your immune system and components of your immune system that are beginning to destroy your collagen tissue because it's confused and thinks your collagen tissue is a foreign invader. In the case of asthma, it might be your lungs that are involved. In vasculitis or dermatitis or psoriasis, it may be the skin that's involved. In other, there's many of these itis-type conditions or inflammatory conditions where the body's immune system begins to react to its own tissue. We call these autoimmune diseases, or diseases where your body's immune system has been thrown off. And one of the things that's thought to throw this off is gut leakage, the absorption of peptide molecules triggering immune responses that are incapable of effectively handling. The medical management of these autoimmune diseases centers around the use of drugs to suppress the overreactive autoimmune response, in other words, to calm the immune system down. The problem with those medications, although they can appear like miracles when they're first used, medications like prednisone or some of the anti-cancer drugs like methotrexate, is that their long-term use has devastating and often deadly consequences. And so a better solution than trying to suppress the immune system is figuring out how to stop the gut leakage that tends to excite this condition in vulnerable people. So what might be causing the screen of our intestinal tract to become damaged or open? Or it's inflammation. Something's inflaming the intestinal mucosa. One of the things that can cause inflammation are free radicals, reactive molecules that can damage tissue. What's a good source of free radicals that might be damaging the intestinal mucosa of humans? Well, one really valuable source of free radicals would be smoking cigarettes. It turns out cigarette smokers are exposed to massive amounts of free radicals. For example, if you look at people that smoke for long periods of time, they often get these very characteristic wrinkles around their face, this premature puckering. Call it like smoker's face. It's when you look at somebody, you can almost tell, even not knowing anything about them, they've probably been a big smoker because they got that prune-like appearance that their face, because that is collagen tissue being damaged with cross-linkaging, secondary to free radicals. And it's not just their faces that are being affected by cigarettes, but tissues throughout their body, including the enamel lining of their blood vessels, which allows sores to form that are associated later with atherosclerosis and plaques and clots and heart attacks and strokes, which is probably one of the reasons why smokers are at much higher risk for some of these other conditions. The free radicals from smoking damages the body. What are other sources of free radicals? Well, for example, the digestion of alcohol. The peroxidation of alcohol yields a lot of free radicals. And so drinking alcohol on a regular basis may be associated with this kind of damage. The use of high fat, particularly high temperature heated fats, like you would get when you eat the flesh of animals after you kill them. When that's cooked at high temperature, you yield a lot of free radicals. So that's why people that are on high animal fat, high animal protein diets may have so much substantially increased risks of many of these diseases. Heated oils, particularly fried foods cooked at high temperature, also an excellent source of high dose free radicals. So if you want to get a lot of free radicals and get the premature wrinkling and increase your risk of dying slowly from these various conditions or rapidly from the consequences of these conditions, a good thing to do would be to smoke, drink alcohol, and eat greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh foods and lots of heated fats and oils. On the other hand, if you'd like to avoid this type of vulnerability to gut leakage, we want to avoid the products that tend to cause the free radical formation. And at the same time, you can choose to avoid foods that lend themselves to gut leakage. It turns out there are some foods that in the inflamed gut cause more problems than others. For example, dairy products. The proteins associated with milk, cheese, yogurt, and products that contain these products are much more reactive clinically than some other proteins. So avoiding dairy products can be very helpful for people to have these autoimmune type responses. Glutinous grains, particularly wheat, rye, and barley, when processed into flour products, often are aggravating for people that have these particular vulnerabilities. And so in those patients, we tend to avoid those types of food products. A way to get the gut that's already inflamed to heal can be associated with therapeutic water-only fasting. It turns out in fasting, if we measure the acute phase reactive proteins that are a monitor of this type of inflammatory process, those acute phase reactive proteins begin to normalize. The inflammation begins to go down, and people begin to heal. If you can fast a person long enough to heal the gut, and then avoid introducing those proteins or those food factors that cause inflammation or lend to gut leakage, you can manage the conditions associated with autoimmune disease. That's why we see patients with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis that are told that diet has nothing to do with their condition. There's nothing they can do. Nobody gets well. It's just about taking these drugs until the consequences occur. We find very different experiences. These people with these problems often get dramatic improvement. And to the degree that they stick to a health-promoting diet and lifestyle, they can often manage and maintain their condition for years or decades. Psychospiritual impact. There are few religious traditions that don't have a history and tradition associated with fasting. Most religions recognize the profound effect a period of fasting can have, both on physical, psychological, and certainly in spiritual realms. Although many people think if you don't eat, that will compromise your immune system's ability to heal itself, it turns out that some of the immune system's enhancements, for example, helper killer T-cell activity, etc., are actually found to be enhanced during the fasting process. And many things that seem to be chronic, annoying problems that don't seem to heal, once people begin fasting, oftentimes heal rapidly. So actually we see fasting, at least in many respects, to be an enhancement, not a deterrent to the body's ability to heal itself. Perhaps one of the most profound effects of fasting involves this issue of neuroadaptation. The body's nervous system adapts in many ways. For example, if you go from a very bright area and into a very dark area, at first you may not see well until the rods and cones in your eyes are able to neuroadapt and adjust to the limited light. You know, if you go into a theater, you may be walking along, stepping on people, kicking them, and you sit down, and it may be a few minutes before you realize what you're actually sitting next to, you know, when your eyes neuroadapt. That's an example of neuroadaptation. Well, neuroadaptation also occurs when it comes to taste. People neuroadapt. If you're used to being on a very high salt diet, your body neuroadapts to that. You need a high amount of salt in order for food to taste good. If you're used to a high fat diet, your body begins to neuroadapt to the high fat diet. You need to have a high fat diet in order to feel satiated, to feel satisfied. If you go on a low sodium diet, it takes people about 1 month on a low sodium diet to neuroadapt to a low sodium diet to where food begins to taste good again. That means for a month your brain is saying, hey, you're not getting enough salt. This isn't a good diet. I don't like this. Go get me some salty food. It means that if you go on a low-fat diet, it will take you up to 3 months before your brain starts protesting that you're not getting enough to eat. You don't feel quite satisfied. You're missing something. You may have just had a huge meal, but if there's not a bunch of fat in it, your brain will object until it neuroadapts. Well, one of the nice things with fasting is this neuroadaptation to a health-promoting diet seems to be greatly accentuated, so it happens much quicker. So after fasting, good food starts to taste good. And so, you know, many times people, when they're used to a high-fat, greasy, slimy diet, and you try to get them on a healthy diet, the body rebels, the mind rebels. And I'll give you a good example. I had a patient here from one of our crane operators, one of our union members, and he was used to hamburgers and alcohol and beer, and really had never eaten whole natural foods before. And he came in the very first day, he took a tour of the facility, and he said to me, you know, Doc, I have to say, this place of yours here is very nice, it's very comfortable, but I had a meal, and if I have to choke down this tasteless swill, I think I'd rather you just kill me right now. Because to him, the idea of eating a health-promoting diet was absolutely inconceivable and intolerable. 2 weeks later, the same guy in the same facility on the same food is saying to me, you know, Doc, you're a cook. He's finally getting the hang of it. It took me a while to convince him that it was the same food, because he was saying, oh no, that tasteless swill you tried to feed me when I first came in, that's not this stuff. This stuff's not bad. It takes a while, even with fasting, to adopt and adapt to a health-promoting diet. It's not something that happens overnight. You have to be patient with your body so it can, but it does. People do get to where good food tastes not bad. They say that nothing works better than aspirin, so when you need relief, maybe we should try nothing. It's available anywhere. There are faster ways to get well than fasting, but fasting is definitely a tool that can be very helpful at getting you from point A to point B in a facilitated time. Health results from healthful living. If you want to get healthy and you want to stay healthy, there's no shortcut to healthful living. Our focus here at the True North Health Center is teaching people, one, to understand what your potential is. Get out of pain, get off the medications, find out what it feels like to be as normal as your body will allow you. And then it's to teach you the skills that you're going to need in order to be able to sustain that into the future. That's what we do, and it works really well. Some of the tools that we have available to help people when they leave True North Health include our cookbook, the Health Promoting Cookbook, which is a cookbook of vegan recipes that avoids all oil, salt, and sugar, and with recipes that are simple enough that even I can make them. And we also have our book, The Pleasure Trap, which really tells the story about the hidden force that undermines health and happiness. It explains not necessarily what you want to hear, but what you need to know if you want to get and stay healthy. Thank you very much.